Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Dairy on the Menu, Bone Health, Wellness, and Inspiration for Every Healthcare Menu. This webinar is sponsored by General Mills Convenience and Food Service, providing the food people love away from home. We're proud to offer the quality products that food service professionals rely on for consistent results in their own operations, as well as the beloved brands their consumers know and trust. Also supporting today's webinar is General Mills Bell Institute of Health and Nutrition. The Bell Institute is a dedicated group within General Mills whose mission is to be the source of scientific health and nutrition expertise that creates value and growth for General Mills. My name is Megan Kilbo. I'm the Healthcare Channel Manager with General Mills, and I will be your host for the webinar today. Now, before we begin today's program, I would like to cover a few housekeeping matters. First, this webinar is being recorded. And second, the recorded webinar, along with the slides that we will be presenting today, will be available within a few weeks on generalmillscf.com. We will also share this content with you in an email. At the end of today's webinar, we will have a Q&A period, and you can submit questions at any time during the webinar by using the chat feature located on the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Please submit your questions. We want to hear from you, and if you have any questions, others on the call are likely wondering the same thing. Also, after the webinar concludes, you will be asked to fill out a short survey and will receive an email with links to the slides and continuing education credit certificates within a week. And final note, we will be playing several videos throughout today's webinar, and the audio for these videos will come through your computer speakers. So if you happen to be listening through a phone line, you will not be able to hear the videos during the webinar, but you can access the recorded version of the webinar later to hear the audio. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Kelsey Mangano. She is a registered dietitian, an assistant professor, and director of nutritional science in the Department of Biomedical and Nutritional Sciences at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. She is a member of the Center for Population Health at UMass Lowell and Center for Microbiome Research at UMass Medical School. Professor Mangano also holds an adjunct faculty appointment at the Marcus Institute for Aging Research, Hebrew Senior Life, Harvard Medical School affiliate. Professor Mangano's research lab aims to elucidate mechanisms behind the impact of nutritional factors and food additives on musculoskeletal aging and the gut. Current mechanisms include alterations in the gut biome and metabolic response to nutrition. During today's webinar, Kelsey will be helping all of us understand the role of nutrition in bone health. Our second speaker is Chef Sonja Kehr. Chef Sonja is a corporate chef at General Mills supporting our healthcare channel and its customers. At General Mills Food Service, Chef Sonja puts her extensive background in healthcare food service, catering, and college and university food service to task. Since joining the company in 2006, she has offered support, training, and culinary solutions to food service operators. She keenly recognizes the important role that food plays in patient satisfaction and a guest total experience. She draws on her expertise in training and development, healthcare solutions, and recipe development to support General Mills' food service customers. During today's webinar, you will see Chef Sonja in action in the kitchen, demonstrating some healthy recipes featuring dairy and calcium. And with that, I will turn it over to Kelsey.
Thank you, Megan, for that kind introduction. I would like to thank the organizers and General Mills for inviting me to speak today on the topic of dairy and its role in bone health throughout the lifespan. On this slide, you will find my disclosures, including current and previous research funding sources. At the end of today's webinar, you will be able to outline the role of nutrition in achieving optimal bone health throughout the lifespan. You will understand the unique role of dairy in influencing bone health, and you will summarize emerging research related to nutrition and bone health. It is important to start by discussing why optimizing bone health throughout the lifespan is so important. Suboptimal bone health is defined by low bone mass, known as osteoporosis. In normal bone tissue, as seen on the right-hand side of that figure, you'll notice that the bone is naturally porous. It has these little holes and crevices for a very specific reason, so that the bone can absorb force in such a way that when you stub your toe, or you fall, or you're in a minor athletic accident, there's no overt breakage in the bone, right? Our bones are able to absorb force. They're meant to be slightly flexible. That's in contrast to the picture you'll see on the left-hand side of that figure, This is an example of osteoporotic bone, where those natural pores have become so enlarged through excess bone resorption that you'll see there's beginnings of little micro fractures, as outlined with that teeny tiny white arrow that's hard to see. These little micro fractures increase a person's propensity to fracture their bones from a simple fall from standing height. So if you fell to your knees from standing height, somebody with osteoporosis is much more likely to shatter their hip than somebody with normal bone tissue. Osteoporosis is a silent disease, meaning that it doesn't usually cause pain or any overt discomfort. However, we should be focused on the prevention of osteoporosis, as low bone mass dramatically increases the risk of bone fracture, and fracture can lead to severe disability. For example, these are some updated statistics showing that of individuals able to walk before a fracture, only 50% can walk after a hip fracture, which is absolutely astounding to me. And there's 10 to 20% excess mortality after a hip fracture. So for all of these reasons, and despite our public health efforts, rates of osteoporosis are on the rise, rates of osteoporotic related fractures are on the rise in the US, Europe, and worldwide. And so therefore, it's our job as health professionals to optimize the well-being of our aging adults, to improve the quality of life, and to reduce healthcare costs. To optimize bone mass and prevent osteoporotic-related fractures, you must first understand how bone mass changes throughout the lifespan. And that's what this figure here is depicting for you, how bone mass changes from early years through old age. Typically, osteoporosis is thought of as an older person's disease, right? But I'd like to argue, and I'm going to present data on this slide to suggest that osteoporosis is actually a pediatric disease, however, with geriatric consequences, and those consequences being osteoporotic-related fractures. So the consequence of osteoporotic-related fractures, as you can see here, let's see if I can get my little arrow going. The fracture, what we're calling on this figure the fracture zone, typically occurs later in life. At some point in our life, as bone naturally declines with aging, we will all reach a point where we have increased risk of fracture. However, what determines how early or late in your life you enter into that higher risk zone dramatically depends on your ability to attain your peak bone mass. 40 to 60% of peak bone mass is accrued between the ages of 10 and 18, where 90% of our peak bone mass is accrued by age 18, and about 100% of our peak bone mass by the time we're age 30 years of age. Bone is maintained over the next few decades of life, and then particularly for women during menopause, there's a severe drop-off in our bone mass, and also for men as they lose testosterone with age. You'll see here that there's 3 dotted lines that follow bone health over the decades of life. The top line is suggestive of a population of people who have achieved their peak bone mass. They've achieved their peak bone mass through their genetic makeup and also by following healthy lifestyle practices that we know impact peak bone mass. These individuals who achieve their peak bone mass are more likely to enter this fracture, higher risk of fracture, much later in life, in their 70s. That's in contrast to this last underneath dotted line, showing a population of people who did not meet optimal peak bone mass, likely because they did not follow lifestyle factors known to properly influence bone accrual. For this reason, these individuals, when they start to have the same decline in bone mass with older age, they fall into the higher risk for fracture much earlier in life, as early as their late 40s or early 50s. So really, really important to attain peak bone mass as children so that we can prevent the geriatric consequences of osteoporosis later in life. There are both non-modifiable and modifiable factors that affect peak bone mass and the bone loss trajectories that I just reviewed with you. So the non-modifiable risk factors include gender, race, and genetics, in contrast to modifiable factors, or known factors that we can have some control over that are known to affect peak bone mass, such as hormonal factors, participating in physical activity, healthy weight, and healthy body composition, and then also various nutrition factors. And the focus of this talk will be on nutritional factors that influence the achievement of optimal peak bone mass. You'll also see on this slide, I've listed for you other factors that are more specific to influencing risk of osteoporotic fracture later in life. So we will highlight again during this talk nutritional factors that have a large influence on risk of osteoporotic fracture later in life. But in addition to diet, I just wanted to highlight for you other factors known to increase risk of fracture, such as impaired vision, low body weight, current smoking status, estrogen deficiency or other androgen deficiencies, dementia, poor health, essentially frailty, recent history of falls, low physical activity, and alcohol consumption generally greater than 2 drinks per day. Before diving into nutritional influencers of bone, it's first really important to understand the complex pathways that alter bone remodeling, and that's what this figure is depicting for you. I always like to highlight for people who don't work in bone every day like I do, that bone is an extremely metabolically active tissue where we actually generate an entirely new skeleton every decade of life. And to accomplish this dramatic revision, constant revision of our bone tissue, there's an expanse network of communication that has to occur within our bone cells and then also with the rest of our body through our enhanced vascular system. So here you'll see that stem cells dictate whether either adipose tissue or various bone cells are generated. So for example, osteoclasts are the bone tissue, bone resorption cells, that break down bone and create those little pockets, while osteoblasts are in communication with the osteoclasts and follow behind and build in new bone. And they have a very strong communication with one another. Bone lining cells actually line or kind of create a canopy over that pocket, that bone modeling unit, where all of the cells are speaking and sort of communicating with one another. And all of these cell types work in concert to respond to different stimuli to either encourage bone building or to encourage bone resorption. You'll see here that mechanical loading on bone, so taking part in physical activity, causes the muscles to contract. The contraction of the muscle tissue physically pulls on bone, and that mechanical loading, the osteoblasts actually physically feel the mechanical loading, and it actually increases their anabolism or propensity to fill in those bone pockets at a greater rate. Hormonal signals, as delivered through our vascular system, have a dramatic impact on anabolism of bone. Growth hormones and androgens are all signals to either upregulate or downregulate bone turnover. Other proteins delivered to bone, for example, inflammatory markers that can either upregulate or downregulate inflammation in the tissue, directly affect the activity of these bone cells. And last but not least, what we're focusing on today are the nutritional influencers. And I think what's the most obvious is that these nutritional factors known to materialize or to harden the hydroxyapatite in the bone tissue, we need direct nutrient delivery to the bone to harden bone and keep it healthy so that it's resorbed at a regular rate. What we might not normally always connect with healthy bone tissue is making the connection that nutrition also has a huge influence on the health of our vascular system. And particularly with aging, this is important, right? We need to maintain the health of our vascular system through proper nutrition and adequate exercise, because only with a healthy, active working vascular system can we deliver these nutrients, cytokines, and hormonal signals to optimize bone health over time. This is a visual abstract, so to speak, that I put together regarding my thoughts in continuously synthesizing the most recent scientific evidence supporting nutrition, diet, and its influence on bone health. And you'll see here what I've done is I've taken certain nutrients and food groups that have been shown to influence bone, and I've attempted to group them together and show you strength of association with bone tissue. So those that are highlighted in a dark green arrow are nutrients or foods that have strong scientific consensus that they positively influence our bone tissue. The ones with the dark red line, such as sugar-sweetened beverages and processed foods, again, there's strong evidence supporting that their influence, they have a negative influence on our bone tissue. The dotted red line between saturated fatty acid intake and bone health, there's some evidence suggesting that saturated fat may be detrimental to bone health, but it's slightly weak. There's not as much consensus, so that's why I put the dotted line. And then the blue arrows with various vitamins and plant protein, again, either neutral evidence or some slight starting evidence to suggest that they may positively influence bone mass, but there isn't a large consensus of evidence yet. Animal protein, which I've highlighted the mechanism here, is probably the most well-researched nutrient and food group in its relation to bone mass and how it affects bone mass. So animal protein has been shown to increase calcium absorption in the gut. This increase in calcium absorption is because the amino acids in animal foods actually weaken or loosen the tight junctions between our enterocytes and allow for greater efflux of paracellular calcium absorption. Animal protein also directly increases insulin-like growth factor 1, so a hormone known to be very dramatically anabolic for bone tissue. Animal protein directly increases protein synthesis in the muscle, which you just heard, pulls on mechanical strain on the bone, increasing osteoblast activity. And lastly, animal protein has been shown to decrease parathyroid hormone, which is a positive reduction in hormone secretion that it positively influences bone health. The European Society for Clinical and Economic Aspects of Osteoporosis and Osteoarthritis put together a consensus statement, trying to also do what I just did with a picture, with a visual abstract, but they put it into a really nice written format that you can find online. I provide you with a reference here. And what they did was they said, okay, based on the most recently available nutrition and bone science, is it possible for us to define a bone healthy diet? And so they felt that dietary protein, vitamin D, and calcium were the most well-supported nutrients in their direct effect on bone tissue, and they were able to quantify how much of these nutrients should be consumed to optimize bone health and prevent against fracture. So optimal dietary protein, meaning intakes of 1.0 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. What I really like about their recommendations is they also focused on recent research suggesting dosage of protein at meal is important. For younger adults, this dosage is 20 to 25 grams of high-quality protein at each meal or bolus close to exercise, or for older adults, it's actually 30 to 35 grams to really optimally deliver essential amino acids that are required to optimize bone and muscle tissue response. They define adequate vitamin D intake at 800 international units per day to maintain serum hydroxyvitamin D levels greater than 50 nanomoles per liter, which has been shown again to optimize bone health in older adults. And they support that calcium intake of 1,000 milligrams per day for healthy adults, 1,200 milligrams a day for older adults, alongside regular physical activity. I love that they highlight this. It's optimizing intake of these nutrients alongside other known lifestyle factors, such as exercising 3 to 5 times a week, is imperative to optimize bone health. Maintain bone tissue and prevent loss of tissue with older age is very important, and they highlight combined with those boluses of protein near exercise ritual. Now the green line here is something that I added myself. So the green line is not from this consensus paper, but I think since 2014, a lot of the new data coming out also really support that in combination with these recommendations, the nutrients coming from foods really have to be from nutrient-dense, bioavailable sources in order to optimize the body's metabolic capability of turning these nutrients, hormonal systems, inflammatory pathways towards a positive influence on bone health. Dairy products, specifically, as an animal protein product, they provide more protein, calcium, magnesium, potassium, zinc, and phosphorus per calorie than any other food, making dairy foods an extremely nutrient-dense food group, right? Getting back to what I just said on the last slide, the delivery of these nutrients has to be from a nutrient-dense food. Table 1 shows the content of these bone-supporting nutrients per 100 grams of commonly consumed dairy foods. And this is particularly important for older age groups when energy intake typically declines with age by 35%. So it's imperative to provide high-density, nutrient-dense foods for people with limited appetite to optimize nutrition or bone health while providing it within their current caloric restrictions and potentially limited appetite. In addition, it's also equally as important for children as obesity and chronic diseases are on the rise in this age group. So providing bone nutrient-dense foods is imperative to support their bone health while helping to engage in healthy energy intake and preventing risk for other cardiometabolic diseases. Not only are dairy foods nutrient-dense, but they also provide the most highly bioavailable source of calcium that we know of in the diet. And again, this is imperative for bone health development and also maintenance with age. Table 2 is taken from a recent review paper published in Calcified Tissue International. And this is showing you here food groups in the far left panel, typical serving size. And what they did was they measured the calcium content of this serving size of food. But beyond the calcium content, they also provided these standard serving sizes to people, flagged them, and followed fluorescent absorption of calcium to determine what is the percent of calcium that's absorbed from each of these food products. And what they found was the dairy products, milk, yogurt, and cheddar cheese specifically, they provided the highest dose of calcium, but not only the highest dose of calcium per standard serving size, their absorbable calcium fraction was around 35%. So they provided the highest propensity of calcium absorption from food across multiple individuals. So then they said, okay, if calcium is the most absorbable from these dairy products, this will be our reference group. That's what the 1 means. And then in the far right column, they said across these other foods, how do they stand up to? Or how much would a person have to consume to then match 1 serving of dairy? So what they found was green leafies like bok choy, kale, broccoli, and spinach, although they provide a relatively high amount of calcium per serving size of vegetable, their fractional calcium absorption was relatively low. So for that reason, for example, to receive the same amount of bioavailable calcium that you would get from a glass of milk or 1 ounce of cheese, for example, the person would have to consume 16 85-gram servings of spinach to receive the same amount of bioavailable calcium. So really demonstrating that although we do get a handful, around, it's an estimate of about 300 milligrams of calcium per day from sort of other foods like green leafies, beans, sprinkled throughout our diet, the highest propensity to receive bioavailable calcium really comes from dairy foods. There are numerous systematic reviews and meta-analyses synthesizing the latest cohort, randomized controlled trials, and case control studies to relate dairy intake to bone health. And it's important to evaluate this research by major life stage. So asking whether dairy affects peak bone mass is a very different question than asking, does dairy positively impact rate of bone loss with age? So because these questions are so different, I've parsed out the data for you by life stage. The beneficial effects of calcium in dairy products on bone mineral mass during growth periods have been confirmed from numerous meta-analyses and numerous clinical studies on calcium supplementation and increased dietary dairy products in children. Table 3 here on your slide shows evidence from 9 randomized controlled trials in both boys and girls, evaluating percent difference in bone mass accrual between dairy food intervention group and control group at varying skeletal sites. Overall, 7 of the 9 RCTs demonstrated significantly higher percent bone mass accrual in the dairy supplemented group compared to the control group. And the range of percentage difference was around 1 to 10% difference in bone accrual between the dairy supplemented group and the control groups. I'm also providing you with evidence from a prospective case control study that demonstrated children who avoided cow's milk for prolonged periods of time, they presented with a 2.7-fold higher fracture risk compared to a matched birth cohort. In addition, a recent National Osteoporosis Foundation position paper conducted a systematic review of literature published since the year 2000 on predictors of peak bone mass and gave evidence grades of A, B, or C, with A being the highest supporting evidence of an effect on peak bone mass accrual. The evidence for the relation of calcium and peak bone mass received a grade of A based on 16 randomized controlled trials, and for dairy intake, a grade of B was provided based on 4 well-designed randomized controlled trials. Now, despite the remarkably strong evidence that dairy foods and calcium from foods are major determinants of peak bone mass, young girls and boys are still not meeting recommended intakes for dairy, as shown here on table 17. So this top row, is what I'm asking you to look at. This is cups of dairy intake per day, and you'll see I've outlined here for you in red that 84 to 94% of girls aged 9 to 30 years and 8 to 68% of boys were still not meeting recommendations for dairy food intakes, despite our current knowledge of how important it is for dairy foods to help attain peak bone mass accrual. Therefore, research is needed to understand why this major food group deficiency in children still exists, and new public health messaging should really be built off of these findings to provide more effective behavior change related to dairy food intakes among children. Studies evaluating the effect of dairy foods on age-associated bone losses and fracture risk in adults are much more heterogeneous than those in adolescents, and for that reason, the numerous meta-analyses in adults are more conflicted. So studies or data from cohort studies and randomized controlled trials in adults generally show a direct relationship of total dairy, so milk plus cheese plus yogurt intake on average throughout the day, with change in bone over time. So essentially less loss of bone over time is associated with greater dairy intakes across a multitude of studies in adults. Now, what's a little bit more conflicting is data on risk of fracture with dairy intake. And so this figure is from a meta-analysis by Haidot published in 2020, showing that the relationship with fracture potentially varies by dairy food group. So higher yogurt intake, here's the consensus here, higher yogurt was related to a 22% risk reduction in hip fracture, but this was not observed with cheese intake. Oftentimes, differences in associations between subgroup of foods, or here specifically subgroups of dairy foods, is actually due to lack of variation in intake. So if in the population that you're asking this research question, there's very little variation in intake, meaning everybody consumes relatively similar amounts of a food group, we really can't statistically tease out or test differences between low and high intakes of these dairy food groups. So that's some of the reason why some of this variation is observed between studies. Further, this study also reported that risk of hip fracture with milk consumption were only observed among American adults, but not observed when they also asked the same question in Scandinavian adults. And they purport that this is likely because milk is more commonly fortified with vitamin D in the US and not in Scandinavian countries, again suggesting a very specific response to dairy foods and its relation to risk of fracture. And I'll come across some of these challenges for you in the coming slides. I just realized there's an error. So this figure, I just want to be clear, is from this meta-analysis by Haidot, but the 2018 meta-analysis by Beyond is also a great reference if you'd like to look it up, and I provided you with other meta-analyses supporting what I'm saying here on this slide. So studies in adults relating dairy intake to risk of fracture are also highly variable, again, due to the heterogeneity of these studies. So population characteristics vary, such as age, sex, background diets, making it very hard to compare across studies. Serving size estimations vary greatly across studies, particularly comparing US studies to those in other parts of the world. And then types of dairy foods consumed and how people classify dairy also varies by research group. So for example, natural dairy versus processed forms of dairy could elicit very different effects on bone tissue. So all of these considerations really have to be taken into effect when evaluating research related to dairy and bone health. So measuring the effect, so far I've been talking about association on that last slide in adults with fracture risk. Measuring effect on fracture is usually prohibitively expensive. So to measure if providing dairy to a population of people reduced risk of fracture over time will require a minimum of 10-year follow-up across thousands of people, and it would really be a prohibitively expensive study design. So that's why we don't have that data to also help us answer this question. In addition to everything I've said so far, the field of precision nutrition is really drawing our attention to other gaps in the existing literature to perhaps further explain this variation that we're seeing between studies in adults. Limited research in this area suggests that that health response to dairy may differ by subpopulations, interactions with other nutrients and foods, and may vary by individuals' human gut microbiome and metabolome. Prevalence of osteoporosis and low bone mass differs by race and ethnicity in the United States. According to NHANES data from 2005 to 2014, the highest prevalence of osteoporosis is among Asian females, followed by that of Hispanic females. And similar patterns are also observed across ethnic cohorts in men, although the prevalence rates are lower. Despite this information, data demonstrate that ethnic groups with the highest prevalence of osteoporosis are actually the least likely to be approached by their healthcare providers regarding bone health. They're less likely to receive DEXA scans that would otherwise diagnose their bone health. And if and when they're diagnosed with osteoporosis, these ethnic groups are less likely to receive treatment when they are diagnosed with osteoporosis. So I wanted to highlight for you these health disparities in bone because I also think it relates to this question of how does dairy associate with bone loss over time? How does it relate to risk of fracture? And we really need more research across different ethnic cohorts. To help address the disparities in bone health, I've put a few of my own thoughts here on this slide. And I think as a medical profession and scientific profession, we need to enhance consumer education to make sure that we are truly reaching all persons regarding known factors such as dairy and its influence on peak bone mass. We need to adapt some of these cultural food practices. So in suggesting dairy intakes to different ethnic groups, we need to make sure that the recommendations hold within cultural and religious practices and modify recipes and recommendations as appropriate. Only by increasing food access for all can we provide these known food groups to promote equality in bone health. We need to eliminate racial biases among medical professionals and also communicate these education pieces and recommendations in native languages. So now I'm also continuing along this understanding that dairy intake may alter rate of bone accrual and loss differently, right, across different subpopulations. So outside of differing genetics and ethnic or race responses, data also suggests that the influence of dairy on bone varies by person dependent upon other factors within the food matrix of each of the foods they consume, the nutritional status of that individual, and it really depends on the context of the overall dietary pattern of each individual. So let me give you a few examples here. Data from our group demonstrate that among men and women from the Framingham osteoporosis study, greater milk and total dairy intakes were related to less 4-year bone loss, but only among individuals who were taking a vitamin D supplement, suggestive of an interaction between vitamin D intake and total dairy's relationship with loss of bone in older adults. These results are corroborated by data from the Boston, Puerto Rican osteoporosis study, where again, milk and total dairy intakes were positively related to bone mineral density, but only among men and women with sufficient vitamin D status. So this time, instead of assessing supplement use, we were able to measure plasma vitamin 25-hydroxyvitamin D. And among adults with sufficient levels defined as greater than 20 nanograms per mil, they provided with the strongest evidence that total dairy was related to improved bone mineral density. So collectively, these results suggest that dairy from foods may have a stronger impact on bone health if a person is deficient in vitamin D, a vitamin known to directly enhance calcium absorption from foods and also known to directly influence the formation of new bone tissue. Generally, we don't eat dairy foods alone. We eat them in the context of an entire dietary pattern. And so for that reason, we asked whether in the context of the whole diet, which protein subgroup could provide the greatest benefit to bone mineral density among participants from the Framingham osteoporosis study. Overall, we found that individuals with the greatest intake of their percentage of energy coming from low-fat dairy, or low-fat milk, they showed the highest bone mineral density across 3 different hip sites and also the lumbar spine. And this difference was statistically significantly greater than those individuals whose greatest protein intake was coming from processed foods or red meat. So therefore, further work is needed to identify whether dairy foods are most beneficial to individuals within the context of higher dietary quality with lesser processed food intakes. I'm going to end talking about precision nutrition and future directions in the field of dairy and bone health. Precision nutrition aims to develop more comprehensive and dynamic nutritional recommendations based on shifting, interacting parameters in a person's internal and external environment throughout life, and really exciting new horizons for research related to dairy and bone health exist within the areas of the gut microbiome and the human metabolome. The gut microbiome is a complex network of organisms, but not just who is there in our guts, but also what is their metabolic activity. And you might be interested to learn or become more aware of the fact that there's strong evidence, a consensus of evidence suggesting, based on what we currently know, the gut microbiome has a direct effect on our bone tissue. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of these pathways for you here. For example, beneficial bacteria and certain probiotics have been shown to support estrogen production, which is directly anabolic for bone tissue. The gut microbiome directly affects inflammatory cytokines, which also are our immune system, and these immune system proteins are also anabolic for bone. And the gut microbiome and shifts in the gut microbiome, 90% of our serotonin is actually produced in the gut. And this serotonin has recently been shown to directly alter bone formation and bone resorption. So I'm just highlighting a couple here. There's numerous mechanisms in which the gut microbiome can alter our bone health. And interestingly, a paper just came out last month in Nature from the PREDICT study suggesting they have evidence in thousands of matched cohort individuals suggesting that diet is a greater influence on our gut microbiome and properties of the gut microbiome than genetics, which is a very powerful study and definitely calls for more research to be done with certain food groups and dietary patterns, such as dairy intake, its influence on the gut microbiome, and then downstream effects on bone. In addition, emerging research suggests that metabolomic profiles, or our bodily responses to varying metabolic activities, also differ by disease status and in response to diet. So here, from the Boston, Puerto Rican osteoporosis study, we were able to identify plasma metabolites that were significantly different among men and women between those with osteoporosis to the right of the 0 and those without osteoporosis, those to the left of the 0. And interestingly, not only were there very specific plasma metabolomic profiles between individuals with and without osteoporosis, we also found that the responses of these metabolic profiles differed by sex. So suggesting that as research advances in these fields, specifically related to dairy and how it could influence bone by altering metabolomic pathways, these future studies really need to pay close attention to sex responses, as the interventions may differ between men and women. And lastly, now that we know that plasma metabolomic profiles differ between people with and without low bone mass, we then want to investigate whether these responses are influenced by dairy product intake. And so that's what this research group aimed to investigate. They provided 38 women on either, they placed them on either a high dairy diet, 4 to 5 servings of dairy per day, or on a low dairy diet, 0 to 1 serving per day, for 24 weeks. And overall, what they found was there were significant differences in the urine metabolome between the low and high dairy groups. A high dairy intake increased urinary excretion of acetone, citrate, creatinine, proline, betaine, and urea, and decreased urinary TMAO and creatinine. So there were direct effects of supplementing in a randomized controlled trial with dairy, and there were overt changes in the urine metabolome between these groups. It was a small study, but absolutely suggestive that further research is needed in this area to help us best understand the how. How do dairy foods then influence peak bone mass accrual and reduce rates of loss of bone over time in older adults? So I hope that from today's presentation, you can conclude that dairy foods provide the most nutrient-dense sources of nutrients known to directly influence bone health, that the evidence strongly supports the positive effect of dairy foods on attaining peak bone mass, that the link between dairy intake and fracture risk is really complicated in adults and needs careful evaluation by subgroup, and that the intersection of dairy and precision nutrition is really exciting and it's emerging, and stay tuned for more research coming out in that area. I want to acknowledge and thank my research team, both at the University of Massachusetts Lowell and the Marcus Institute at Harvard Medical School. I look forward to answering your related questions at the end of this webinar, and now I will turn it over to Sonja.
Thank you, Kelsey. I just wanted to go ahead and introduce what we're going to be viewing. The reminder, too, is for those of you who are joining us just from your phone and not viewing through the internet, you won't be able to hear the video audio for these segments, but it is, since it's recorded, that when you get the materials after the webinar is over, you will be able to hear the audio at that time. In the first video, Kelsey had spoke so highly of using dairy as our primary available source for both calcium and vitamin D in bone health. And, when I was thinking about menuing, I just really wanted to see if I could focus on center of the plate and get as many sources as possible just to have a complementary plate. So we're going to go ahead and look at that first video, and we'll intro each one as we go through.
Hi, today we're talking about recipes with calcium in them. And so one of the things that we wanted to focus on were different ingredients that are higher in calcium. Well, yogurt is one of them. So today we're going to make a simple yogurt dressing, and you can use flavored yogurt, which is actually really awesome, because if you think about like raspberry vinaigrette, all we're going to do is you can take a raspberry yogurt, go ahead and mix that with mustard and a little bit of acid, and then you go ahead and you already have your salad dressing. If you're going to use a plain yogurt, like what we're starting with right now, we're actually going to take the plain yogurt, put it into a bowl. We're going to add a little bit of garlic powder to it to give it some savoriness. You can also do your favorite, like no salt spice blend. Those are really great too. This is our Dijon. This really just kind of gives it that nice bite that you would find in a classic vinaigrette. And last but not least, we're adding an acid. On this occasion, we're using lemon juice, but you can also use orange juice, vinegar, rice vinegar, your choice. If you're going to use like balsamic and red wine vinegar, you might want to pick one of the fruit yogurts to go with because they already have a little bit richer hue to them. If you're doing the plain yogurt, you can also add honey to it, but it's not required. We're going to just give that a little mix. And ideally, you're making your dressing for same day. I wouldn't hold it more than 3 days, and then just be aware that you're in shelf life for your code. That's really our salad dressing that easy. You can also take fresh herbs. In this case, we have a dill because we're going to partner our salad dressing with a grilled salmon. This also works great with canned salmon because you get the extra bones in the canned salmon that you can break down, and a baked potato. With the next set, we have broccoli. And we did our salad, we did a compound salad. There we used the yogurt dressing as the binder instead of having a heavy mayonnaise-laden dressing. And there we're actually just using 70% yogurt. We're still using a little mayonnaise, so that way if the fruit weeps at all, that it still clings to it. And our next set, we have a nice Mediterranean bowl. Here we actually did a vegetable yogurt dressing, similar to tzatziki, but we didn't add as many ingredients. We just did cucumber and tomato. It's a wonderful pairing for a vegetarian plate. And then feel free that you can go ahead and have some baked pita chips on the side for dipping if you like. We'll see you for the next recipe set.
In our next set, we're actually looking at, many of us don't have our dining rooms open full service anymore, or our cafes, you know, have been impacted, so we no longer have self-service. Well, we're trying to utilize, what are we going to do with that salad bar area? How can we use that opportunity to do grab and go, impulse, and still feature different dairy-based offerings? So in the next segment, we're going to look briefly on how to redesign your salad bar and how to offer smoothies or smoothie bowls as entrees in your takeout sections. Let's go ahead and look at that video.
So next, we're going to actually talk about how we can get calcium in like our cafes and food courts. Well, traditionally, it's always been, you know, yogurt parfaits. And so it's really easy to go ahead when, you know, prior to COVID, we used to go ahead and use the bulk yogurt and fill the bins and let everybody do their own topping. Well, now that we don't want to have, you know, other people touching our stuff, what we did was we actually pre-scaled. So this is 4 ounces of yogurt in a cup. But what we're doing is you can have your choice. If you have the labor available, it's cheaper to do bulk and go ahead and portion your own. But if you don't, this is also extremely convenient. So we also did, this is a 6 ounce size, and these are our 6 ounce offerings for the yogurt pre-pack. And what you can do is just set those on ice and let people do their own. Now, the new salad bar is that we actually have the items pre-scaled. You're saying, okay, pick 1 yogurt and 3 toppings equals X cost, or you want to go ahead and pick 2 yogurts and 5 toppings, and then you have an entree for like a smoothie bowl. So if you make your own, you know, you can pre-package them, put those in your grab and go, or you can give your customers the option of doing their own, but you're just having the individual components to let them mix and match. Make sure that you provide additional space so that they can add their toppings and still have room to eat them. Or if they're doing the entree bowl, go ahead and put like a carry-out entree bowl. In addition, you see as we have the different parfaits, it works great into our smoothies as well. So as long as you're talking about parfaits, when you get a big parfait, then it becomes a smoothie bowl. And so here we took that same parfait bag and we used the strawberry ParfaitPro, and then we just added some canned fruit and fresh fruit combination. So whatever you have in stock works great there. And then when we did our savory option, this one's using the plain yogurt but using vegetables along with it. And you can actually still portion those up on the sides as well. But having one on display really helps people have a better idea of how they're going to build their own kit. And this is what it would look like. So 1 container equals this size, 2 containers equals this size. So as we did the parfaits in a cup, let's actually go ahead and do 1 smoothie for you today. So since we're focusing on calcium, we're going to make a kale, yogurt, orange juice smoothie. So that way we have our dark leafy greens, which are a good source of calcium. So we're going to put those in the blender first. I'm going to dry blend them, but I'm put just a hint of orange juice to get it started. And so this is going to be loud. We're going to turn this on real quick. We'll drizzle in a little more orange juice. Okay, so now we're going to scrape it down. We're going to add our yogurt. And this is the vanilla yogurt too. It doesn't have to be plain. Okay. We're also going to put in about a teaspoon of sriracha, but you can use, Tabasco, whatever your favorite is. And you'll notice we actually used a calcium fortified orange juice as well. So we're really trying to get all that calcium in there for you. So we're going to blend this up again. We're just going to fold in the remainder of the orange juice. And you'll notice the recipe has half kale and half romaine. And it's your choice. You can make it a real power smoothie, or if you like it a little bit milder, you're not so green. Let's get our glasses out here. Snuck that in there. Okay, I'll let you portion out. It should be 4 servings off of this one. So this is just a reminder that for the new type of salad bar, we're bundling. We're doing some pre-portioned items. We're doing some of our own pre-packed items. We have different additional fortified snacks and cereals that you can choose from. And then we're also showing people how they can build their own smoothies using those components. So enjoy.
And in our last segment, this one I actually really enjoy, that when we're thinking about hydration or activities, that just being able to have, a high protein snack in addition to, our calcium beverage, it's just so delicious, the different ways that you can feature this. So let's go ahead and jump into this video too.
So in this segment, we're going to talk about supplements and nutrition and floor stock. And many of you might be familiar with those protein beverages that come in a can. The only negative side is sometimes those can be perceived as chalky because of the protein powder. So we're actually going to make a homemade version using the Yoplait bulk yogurt. We're adding peanut butter as part of boosting our protein. We put a little bit of sweetened condensed milk in the bottom. We're going to show you how to open the big bag. Really easy. Tear it across. Measuring out 2 cups. Okay, I'm going to move that there for a second. So then you can see if you need to scrape this down, you actually can do it on the edge of the table, or you can use a plastic bench scraper. Then I like to store it just inside like a plastic camera or measuring cup, whatever is preferable in your house. You can also scrape it down with a plastic bench scraper. So we're just going to add the yogurt to our peanut butter and sweetened condensed milk. We're going to blend these up first so it makes kind of a creamy, well dispersed mousse. And then we'll add 2 cups of milk in the second half. So I'm using a hand blender today, but if you're making bigger batch, you can also do it in a bigger blender. Or for single serving, you can use a Roboku. So this first part, you got a really luscious peanut butter mousse. You could stop here if you want. And do it like a pudding snack. But we're going to go ahead and add our additional 2 cups of whole milk. blend it again. Okay, I'm going to get a plate here just to set this down so I don't drip. Okay. And we're going to do this one for the rocks, one for the road. And look at how nice, thick, and creamy that is. So it's delicious just like this, but you could also add, you know, a whipped topping with some sprinkles. You could always top it off with some toasted almonds. The ever popular, you could always do some brownie fingers to go with it. We actually did some additional snack bars for your nourishments, but using yogurt as a primary. So we have a lemon breakfast bar. You can do it as a cupcake, a bun cake. We also have one that has yogurt and bananas and oatmeal for a breakfast bar. So what's even better for snacks and nourishment or activities than popsicles? So a really easy way to do different assorted flavors in popsicles is to actually just put a stick in the top of the yogurt, freeze it, and then you can take it out at least a half an hour ahead. The cool part about this is it actually plans for distribution, so it stays cold and firm as you're going to take it for snacks. You can see here we have a 4-ounce size, how easily it pops out of the container. It's great with the different flavors. It's also great too just for quality control to keep your temperatures cold on the line. So if you don't want to do the popsicle stick part, you just put your yogurts in the freezer first, and then when it's time for tray line, then it stays nice and creamy cold. We also did one more. So if you want, you can have peanut butter banana and do a little snack that way. Hopefully you'll enjoy our ideas for adding a little more calcium into your snacks and nourishment program. Thank you.
So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Megan, who's going to open it up for questions.
All right, thank you, Sonja. And so now we can begin our Q&A. So we've already gotten some great questions. One of the first questions that has come in here is, how can children reach optimal mass if lactose intolerant?
That's a great question. Sorry, I didn't ask if that was coming to me or Sonja. I just kind of jumped in. But okay if I take it first, and then maybe
of course.
Okay, then maybe Sonja can support. So both for children and adults who report lactose intolerant, I think first there's a demand as nutrition professionals to help individuals figure out if it's truly a lactose intolerance that's causing the problem. We now have greater awareness of other FODMAPs and nutritional influences of IBD and other gastrointestinal disorders. So first, ruling out that it truly is a lactose intolerance, I think is extremely important. Second of all, if it truly is a lactose intolerance, there are lactose-free dairy products where the dairy product essentially provides still that nutrient-dense, bone-benefiting nutrients, but they've had the enzyme lactase added to them. So there's minimal to no lactose content in these dairy products, and people should be able to tolerate them as it's truly a lactose intolerance. I've also found that with some clients, because yogurt, certain types of yogurt are typically low in their lactose content, and hard cheeses are typically lower in their lactose content, I recommend trying these sources first. And then if there's a perpetual issue, I might turn to dairy alternatives. But I always try those mechanisms first because truly calcium is most bioavailable from these dairy foods. So if possible, providing these lactose-free alternatives would be my first mechanism.
Perfect, thank you. And we can fit in one more question just in the interest of time. I think this would be great for Chef Sonja. Are the shakes demonstrated good for 3 days in the refrigerator as well, or can you speak to kind of holding recommendations?
Yeah, ideally, we try not to hold more than 24 hours on most of the products, just because sometimes that you can get different thickening happening with the products. And so if you're using these as part of a modified texture, menu item, then definitely you would need to be aware of that timeline. Really the biggest hurdle is just monitoring the shelf life on your dairy and making sure that once you initiate the recipe, you don't exceed that. So Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And just in the interest of time here, I would like to move ahead, but we can certainly follow up with some answers to these additional questions. I would like to highlight some news from Yoplait to help you serve calcium to your patients and residents. So we have renovated our Yoplait Original 6-ounce yogurt to deliver even better nutrition. So just wanted to highlight that here. It's an excellent source of calcium and vitamin A, has 15% of the daily value of calcium of vitamin D per serving, and it's gelatin-free. And it has more calcium and vitamin D per cup than Dannon. So we're really excited about this, and this is in the market now. So you can serve the nutrition your customers need with the Yoplait taste that they love. And as a sneak peek at what's to come, we are also updating our Yoplait Light Yogurt. So both our 4-ounce and 6-ounce cups that you're probably used to tray dining as well as retail. And these will be in market in April. So we're updating our light formula to deliver the nutrition that consumers are looking for. And so we're going from 4 grams of added sugar down to just 1, from 10 grams of total sugar down to just 7, from 90 calories per serving to 80 calories, and we are still maintaining that 0 grams of fat. And not only that, our light yogurt has less sugar than Dannon Light and Fit. So again, we're really excited about this as well. And these changes will make our Yoplait Light yogurt relevant to 5 times more diets and to help you reach even more customers. We have some more information and planograms to help guide your retail set linked here at the bottom of the slide. And when we send these slides out to you after today's webinar, you can use these links to access that for more information. And also, to thank you for joining today's webinar, we would like to offer you a free case of General Mills product. And so this could include Yoplait yogurt, like single serve for patient or resident dining or retail, or bulk yogurt for items like smoothies and parfaits, cereal, anything from popular bowl pack items to variety packs and more. So we will send an email to you after this webinar with more information on how to redeem that offer. And the first 50 people to redeem will get a free bonus surprise. So there's a fun incentive to look forward to. And the deadline for those free case redemptions is Wednesday, February 24th. And as mentioned earlier, you will be asked to fill out a short survey at the conclusion of this program, and we'll be receiving an email shortly that will have links to these slides that we've covered so you can review and print them out, to the recording of the webinar, as well as to the continuing education certificates. And we also invite you to follow the Bell Institute and General Mills Foodservice on social media. You can explore our websites, which have nutrition and education resources, videos, recipes, and more. And lastly, be sure to watch your inbox for future webinars and free continuing education opportunities from us. And with that, we are ready to conclude today's program, and you may now disconnect. Thank you guys so much for joining.